At some point along the path, something quietly changes. You wake up one morning and realize that the things which once drove you forward no longer have the same pull. Success, achievement, recognition, progress. All the symbols that once defined a meaningful life now feel strangely hollow. You still understand why they mattered. You can see why others chased them. But inside, the fire that once pushed you to strive has dimmed, and this unsettles you. You begin to wonder if something is wrong. Have you become lazy? Have you lost ambition? Have you failed in some invisible way? Alan Watts would say that what you are experiencing is not a loss, but a revelation. According to Watts, most people live their entire lives motivated by an image of who they think they should become. Successful, respected, accomplished, secure. And from a very early age, this image is handed to us by society, parents, teachers, culture. We are told implicitly and explicitly that our worth is something to be earned, that life is a ladder and the purpose of living is to climb it. Each achievement promises satisfaction. Each milestone whispers, when you get here, you'll finally be enough. But what happens when you reach a rung and feel nothing? Or when you realize that even imagining the next rung no longer excites you? Watts explained that this is often the moment when the illusion of achievement begins to crack. You see, achievement is always about the future. It's about becoming something later that you are not now. And the moment you truly begin to wake up, this endless postponement of fulfillment starts to feel absurd. Why, you ask? Must life always be justified by what comes next? This loss of motivation can feel deeply disorienting because achievement has likely structured your entire identity. You may have defined yourself by your goals, your productivity, your upward movement. Without that narrative, there is a strange emptiness, a sense of floating without direction, and the mind panics. It says, if I'm not striving, I'm failing. If I'm not progressing, I'm wasting my life. But Alan Watts would gently point out that this panic arises not from truth, but from conditioning. He often said that society trains us to confuse motion with meaning, to believe that constant improvement is the same as living well. But trees do not rush to become taller than they already are. The sun does not compete with itself to shine brighter tomorrow. Life, in its natural form, unfolds without obsession over outcomes. It simply expresses itself. When you are no longer motivated by success, it may be because you are beginning to sense this deeper rhythm, one that does not require you to prove your existence through accomplishment. This is not yet freedom. It is the threshold. The point where the old engine of motivation stops working, but the new way of being has not yet revealed itself. And standing in this space can feel frightening, confusing, even meaningless. But according to Alan Watts, this is often the exact moment when awakening begins to move from an idea to a lived reality. As this realization deepens, another uncomfortable insight emerges. Much of what you once called ambition was fueled by fear. Alan Watts often spoke about how the drive for success is rarely a pure love of creation or contribution. More often, it is an attempt to secure oneself against uncertainty, rejection, and impermanence. We strive not simply because we enjoy the work, but because we fear what will happen if we do not strive. We fear being seen as insignificant, unworthy, or left behind. And so achievement becomes a kind of psychological armor. Something we wear to protect ourselves from the rawness of existence. When awakening begins, this armor starts to feel heavy. You notice the tension beneath your goals, the constant anxiety about outcomes, the endless comparison, the quiet dread of falling short. And gradually, your system refuses to cooperate anymore. You cannot summon the same hunger for success because your awareness has outgrown the fear that once powered it. This can feel like exhaustion, like burnout, like a sudden loss of energy. But according to Alan Watts, it is often a sign that the mind has begun to see through its own game. He explained that success, as society defines it, is always relative. You are successful compared to someone else, ahead of someone else, above someone else. But this creates a perpetual race with no finish line. No matter how far you go, there is always someone further ahead, always another level to reach. The moment you see this clearly, the motivation collapses. Why exhaust yourself in a race that never ends? Why keep climbing a ladder that leans against no real wall? At this stage, you may find yourself doing less, achieving less, or even withdrawing from pursuits that once defined you. And this triggers guilt. You hear internal voices saying you are wasting your potential, throwing your life away. But Alan Watts would suggest that what you are actually wasting is the illusion that your life must be justified by productivity. He often pointed out that the universe is not going anywhere. It is not improving itself towards some final achievement. It is simply playing, unfolding, expressing. This is difficult to accept because we have been conditioned to believe that rest is earned, that peace comes after accomplishment. Yet awakening reverses this logic. You begin to sense that peace is the ground from which meaningful action arises, not the reward at the end of striving. When motivation driven by fear dissolves, what remains is a strange stillness, a waiting, a feeling of not knowing what comes next. And the mind interprets this as failure when in fact it may be the first honest pause you have ever taken. Alan Watts often compared this stage to standing still in a world obsessed with motion. To those around you, it may look like you have lost your edge. But inwardly, something far more significant is happening. The machinery of egoic striving is slowing down. And in that slowing, you are being invited to discover a different source of action, one that does not arise from fear, comparison, or the need to become someone else. This is not yet clarity. It is disorientation. But it is a necessary disorientation. Because as long as success motivates you, you remain trapped in the illusion that life is something to be earned. An awakening begins when that illusion can no longer hold. As the drive for success loosens its grip, a deeper question begins to surface, often quietly at first. If I am no longer chasing achievement, then who am I? Alan Watts frequently emphasized that much of what we call identity is built upon roles, accomplishments, and future-oriented narratives. We are not simply people. We are students, professionals, achievers, winners, failures, identities defined by movement towards something else. When motivation fades, these identities begin to wobble, and with them comes a subtle sense of groundlessness. This is where many people become frightened and try to revive their old ambitions. They set new goals, raise the stakes, or reinvent themselves in a more meaningful way. But Watts would say that this urge to remotivate is the ego's attempt to survive. The ego does not want freedom. It wants continuity. It wants a story, and achievement provides a very convincing one. It says, I am becoming, I am progressing. I matter because I am going somewhere. When that story collapses, the ego experiences it as a kind of death. You may notice this as a vague anxiety, a restlessness without a clear object. There is nothing specific you want, yet you feel uneasy doing nothing. According to Alan Watts, this discomfort reveals how deeply we have been conditioned to equate stillness with worthlessness. We feel we must be moving towards something to justify our existence. Without a goal, the mind feels exposed, as if life itself were suddenly unsupported. But Watts would gently point out that this exposure is not a mistake. It is an unveiling. Achievement was never supporting your life. Life was supporting achievement. You were alive before you had goals, before you succeeded at anything, before you proved yourself. And yet you existed fully. The problem is not that motivation has disappeared. The problem is that motivation was never meant to carry the weight of your being. At this stage, a strange paradox appears. You may feel less driven, yet more aware, less ambitious, yet more sensitive, less interested in winning, yet more attuned to the texture of everyday experience. Alan Watts often described this as the shift from living for something to living as something. Instead of existing for success, for recognition, for arrival, you begin to exist as presence itself, as awareness experiencing life moment by moment. This does not mean you become passive or inactive, but action, when it arises, comes from a different place. Not from the need to secure a future identity, but from the natural expression of what is happening now. Watts compared this to music. You do not listen to music to reach the final note. If you did, the fastest musicians would be the best. Music is meant to be played, not finished. And life, he said, is the same. When you stop treating existence as a task to complete, achievement loses its hypnotic power. Still, this realization takes time to settle. The mind continues to ask, but what am I for? And there is no immediate answer. According to Alan Watts, the answer does not come in the form of a new goal, but in the gradual recognition that you were never meant to be for anything at all. You are not a means to an end. You are the happening itself. And seeing this is deeply unsettling and deeply liberating. As you stand in this liminal space, neither motivated by the past nor pulled toward the future, a curious sense of liberation begins to appear. Alan Watts often spoke of this stage as the quiet rebellion of the self against its own conditioning. All those years of striving, of chasing accolades and social approval, suddenly seem like a dream, a kind of elaborate play. The rules of the game no longer compel you. And yet, paradoxically, this freedom can feel terrifying because you are used to structure. Achievement provided scaffolding. Goals gave life a predictable rhythm. Without them, there is an unsettling sense of suspension, a vertigo of existence. You may notice yourself asking, if I am not doing this to succeed, then what is the point of anything? Watts would say that this is the mind struggling to understand what it cannot yet grasp. Point, purpose, meaning, these are constructs built on desire and fear. When those forces fade, the constructs collapse. Life feels empty. But it is precisely in this emptiness that the mind encounters reality directly. For the first time, there is nothing between you and what is. There is no story, no goal, no justification required. And this is simultaneously frightening and intoxicating. In this silence, you may also feel a subtle anger or confusion toward the world that taught you to equate achievement with worth. Watts often noted that part of the awakening process involves seeing through cultural illusions. We have been sold the idea that life is a ladder, a race, a ledger to balance, when in truth, existence has no inherent need for measurement. The anger arises because your consciousness recognizes the absurdity of what you once took seriously. It is not bitterness toward life, but recognition of the arbitrary rules you once believed. And here, in this very space, something extraordinary begins to unfold. Without the compulsive drive for external validation, your attention naturally shifts inward. You begin to notice subtler aspects of life. The quality of your breath, the texture of a leaf, the rhythm of your thoughts. Actions that once felt like obligations now arise spontaneously, effortlessly. Watts often compared this to the wind moving a leaf. The leaf does not strain, it does not plan. It moves simply because conditions allow it. In the same way, life begins to move through you rather than being directed by you. Yet this stage is not about passivity, it is about presence. Motivation has shifted from fear and desire to attunement with the moment. What arises now, creativity, relationships, contribution, emerges naturally, like ripples spreading in water. You do not need to force it. You do not need to measure it. Watts reminded us that the universe is a spontaneous dance. Once you step out of the need to justify your existence through achievement, you participate in that dance fully. You are no longer a competitor or a climber. You are simply part of the unfolding. This is a subtle but profound shift that occurs when you are no longer motivated by success. The old engines of ambition have stopped, but the river of life continues. And you begin to understand what Watts so often emphasized. Life does not need to be earned. It simply is, and in this being, there is a freedom that achievement could never provide. As this awareness deepens, you begin to notice the subtle ways your old ambitions shaped your sense of self. Alan Watts often observed that identity and achievement are intimately entwined. We measure ourselves by the trophies we hold, the promotions we receive, the recognition we earn. Without these markers, the ego feels exposed, raw, and unanchored. And yet, in this exposure, there is the first taste of true freedom. For the first time, your value is not determined by external measures. It is intrinsic, present, and unearned. You exist not as a result of what you accomplish, but as a result of simply being. This stage can feel disorienting because, without achievements to structure your life, everything appears open-ended. Time seems longer, choices feel heavier, and the mind often searches desperately for something to latch onto. Watts described this as a kind of vertigo, a moment in which the mind realizes that it has been living in a story of its own making. And yet, if you can endure this vertigo, something extraordinary happens. You discover that life is not a story that needs to be completed. It is an ongoing unfolding, complete in itself, and participation does not require justification. Interestingly, when ambition fades, your perception of success begins to change. Alan Watts pointed out that the truly awake individual no longer measures life by accumulation, by climbing ladders, or by winning approval. Instead, the measure of life becomes depth, the richness of experience, the clarity of perception, and the freedom to act in harmony with reality. What once seemed meaningless or unproductive now becomes infused with subtle significance. A simple conversation, a walk in nature, a quiet moment alone, suddenly feels alive in a way that no trophy ever could. This shift also transforms your relationship with failure. When success is no longer the yardstick, failure loses its power. You no longer fear judgment because you are not striving to prove yourself. Watts often emphasized that fear and desire are the twin engines of suffering. When both subside, what remains is equanimity, a grounded presence that can encounter life as it is, without resistance. Even setbacks become opportunities to observe and understand rather than crises to escape or overcome. At this stage, many people feel a subtle alienation from society. Friends, family, and colleagues may not understand why you no longer chase recognition, why you seem less ambitious, why you are no longer anxious about success. Watts would describe this as the natural consequence of awakening. You have outgrown the old narratives that once dictated behavior. And while this can feel lonely at first, it also opens the door to a more authentic connection, one that is not based on competition, comparison, or achievement, but on presence and understanding. And so you begin to inhabit a new rhythm of life. The compulsion to prove yourself dissipates, leaving space for spontaneous action, creativity, and engagement. You move with life rather than against it. Watts often likened this to dancing. When you stop trying to lead or control, the dance flows effortlessly, harmoniously, beautifully. Motivation is no longer external. It is internal, natural, arising from the subtle alignment of being with the moment. The old struggle fades, replaced by a quieter, more profound fulfillment. A joy that is not earned, but simply recognized. As this new rhythm takes hold, you may notice something subtle yet profound. Your relationship with time itself begins to change. Alan Watts often observed that ambition traps us in a future-oriented mindset. Success is always about what comes next, and achievement is never complete because there is always another milestone ahead. When motivation fades, the tyranny of the future relaxes. You are no longer racing against an invisible clock. The present moment becomes your natural home. Life is no longer something to conquer or manage. It is something to inhabit, fully and unconditionally. And yet, this freedom can be disquieting. The mind, accustomed to constant movement and tangible outcomes, feels exposed. It whispers, if I am not producing, then I am nothing. Watts reminded us that these whispers are illusions, echoes of a conditioned ego. You are not your productivity. You are not your resume, your title, your bank account, or your achievements. You are consciousness experiencing itself. And the cessation of striving is not emptiness, it is space. It is the room in which true insight, creativity, and fulfillment can arise naturally, without coercion or force. At first, this space may feel lonely. Those around you may not understand why you no longer compete, why you are less ambitious, why your desire for recognition has dimmed. Watts would note that awakening often separates you from old patterns and relationships because your perspective has shifted. But this is not rejection or failure. It is alignment. You are simply moving through life according to a new, deeper logic, one that prioritizes authenticity over social expectation, presence over accomplishment, being over doing. In this state, you begin to see clearly the subtle illusions of achievement. Success, Watts explained, is often a measure not of value but of conformity. Society tells us what is valuable and we chase it, mistaking external approval for inner worth. The awakening mind recognizes this pattern and begins to disentangle itself. Motivation no longer arises from fear or desire. It arises from natural engagement with what life presents. You act not to prove yourself, but because action itself is a joyful expression of existence. The work you do, the relationships you nurture, the passions you explore, all are now infused with intrinsic meaning, not external validation. And here lies the paradox. By losing the old motivation, you gain a far greater power. Watts often described this as the power of effortless action. When the ego no longer drives every decision, you move with life, not against it. Your actions become harmonious, effective, and even extraordinary, not because you are pushing harder, but because you are in tune with the flow of reality. This is a freedom that ambition cannot buy, a clarity that success cannot create. You are no longer trying to arrive somewhere. You are already fully present, fully alive, fully awake. This is the essence of the stage where you are no longer motivated by success. It is both terrifying and liberating. The old scaffolding is gone, but the structure of life itself remains. And in that space, you begin to discover a life lived with depth, presence, and authenticity, a life that no external achievement could ever provide. As this understanding deepens, you may notice a subtle shift in how you view failure, loss, and disappointment. Alan Watts often pointed out that ambition is intertwined with fear, fear of inadequacy, fear of being overlooked, fear of being left behind. When the mind is driven by success, every setback feels catastrophic because it threatens your carefully constructed identity. But when motivation dissolves, these fears lose their grip. Failure no longer defines you. It no longer signals deficiency. It becomes simply an event, a part of life's unfolding, neither good nor bad, neither urgent nor final. This detachment from outcome is not apathy. It is presence. Watts explained that life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced. When you act without the compulsive need to achieve, your actions become playful, creative, and surprisingly effective. You may find that solutions arise effortlessly, relationships deepen naturally, and your work takes on a new kind of vitality. The absence of fear-driven ambition allows space for insight, for spontaneity, for alignment with life's natural flow. Success is no longer a measurement. It is a byproduct, a reflection, not a goal. And here, in this space, you begin to reconnect with your true motivations, those that were always beneath the surface, obscured by the noise of expectation and obligation. Watts often said that the authentic self is never separate from life itself. It does not need to prove or acquire because it already exists fully. When the compulsion to achieve fades, you begin to act from curiosity, from wonder, from the joy of engagement itself. You pursue not what the world tells you is important, but what naturally calls to you. This is a quieter, deeper kind of fulfillment, one that requires no applause, no certificate, no validation. Interestingly, the world may continue to measure success as it always has. Others may still chase promotions, trophies, or recognition. And while it may feel strange to stand apart, Watts reminded us that awakening always creates a gentle distance. The awakened mind does not reject life. It simply sees the illusions beneath the social narrative. You can participate fully, yet you are not bound. You can create, contribute, and excel, but these actions arise organically, not compulsively. At this stage, you begin to notice subtle joys that were always present, but previously ignored. The warmth of sunlight on your skin, the rhythm of your breath, the quiet beauty of ordinary moments, all are now amplified by your freedom from constant striving. Watts often likened this to stepping out of a noisy crowd into a quiet forest. The forest was always there, but until you stopped running, you could not fully inhabit it. Similarly, when the old drive for achievement falls away, life reveals its subtle, inherent richness. This is the paradoxical gift of losing motivation for success. You gain access to a life of authenticity, depth, and freedom. The engine that once drove you outward into endless striving has stopped, but in its place arises a life of presence, clarity, and spontaneous engagement. You move not because you must, but because life itself moves through you effortlessly and beautifully. At this final stage, you begin to see what Alan Watts often described as the illusion of control. Success, achievement, and recognition are all outward measures of competence. Yet they create a fragile identity, one that depends on circumstances, timing, and the judgment of others. When the drive to achieve dissolves, you realize how much of your previous life was spent trying to manipulate reality in order to sustain an image of yourself. Watts would remind us that the universe does not need your approval or participation to unfold. It flows naturally. And once you stop forcing yourself to achieve, you step into that flow. This is not resignation. It is not giving up. It is a conscious surrender to the rhythms of life. The mind may resist at first, asking, if I do not strive, will I lose everything? But Watts would say that in fact, by letting go of compulsion, you gain everything. Clarity, freedom, and a sense of being fully present. Motivation no longer comes from fear, desire, or the illusion of deficiency. It comes from resonance with life itself. You act because the moment calls you, not because the future demands it. And in that resonance, your actions are far more meaningful, far more creative, and far more alive than anything forced by ambition ever was. In this space, you may notice that time slows down. Life becomes less about accumulating experiences and more about inhabiting them fully. Watts often used the metaphor of music. When a musician plays, the joy is not in reaching the final note, but in being immersed in the unfolding melody. Similarly, living without the compulsion to succeed allows you to experience each moment fully, without constantly measuring it against what comes next. The ordinary becomes extraordinary simply because you are fully present. You may also notice a subtle shift in relationships. Connections are no longer transactional. Friends, colleagues, and loved ones are no longer mirrors of your achievement or status. Interactions are deeper, more authentic, more compassionate. Watts suggested that when one stops seeking validation from the world, one becomes capable of giving it fully, not as a duty, but as a natural expression of presence. Love, friendship, and collaboration emerge from a different place. Not scarcity, but abundance. Not competition, but flow. Finally, this stage reveals the ultimate lesson Watts emphasized repeatedly. Life is not a problem to solve, a ladder to climb, or a race to win. It is a mystery to experience, a dance to participate in, a flow to inhabit. By no longer being motivated by success, you are freed from the illusions that once limited your consciousness. You begin to live not as a projection of expectation, but as the reality of your own being, spontaneous, alive, and free. Achievement is no longer a goal. It is a natural byproduct of living fully. In this surrender, there is peace. In this letting go, there is freedom. In this absence of compulsion, there is life, fully, deeply, undeniably alive. And as Alan Watts reminded us, this is not a philosophy to study or a technique to master. It is an invitation to stop striving, to stop proving, to stop measuring, and to begin simply being, right here, right now. This is where true motivation arises, not from fear, not from desire, but from the effortless, radiant flow of life itself.